Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Melanoma Research Foundation Virtual Advocacy Days. We are so happy to have you all join us and thrilled that you have the opportunity to chat with your lawmakers, share your stories, and help us change things for the melanoma community in the most impactful and meaningful way. So today, before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsors, the wonderful group of companies that have so generously sponsored this year's event. So let's please give them a big virtual round of applause. Thank you again to these wonderful companies who have generously supported the mission of the Melanoma Research Foundation and this virtual event today. So without further ado, I wanted to take a moment and share a little bit about the MRF, about our advocacy platform, and then also what you can expect this week. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and kick us off this morning. So I'm going to kick things off by giving everybody a little bit of background about the MRF, how the foundation started, and what our mission is today. So a little over 25 years ago, the MRF was founded by a patient, a young woman by the name of Diana Ashby, who was facing her third recurrence of melanoma. And over 25 years ago, there were no FDA-approved treatments for melanoma, and she was told that she had no more options available to her. So instead of giving up her fight, she chose to use her voice and advocate for the melanoma community, and thus formed the Melanoma Research Foundation. So at the time, our mission was really to fund research, but over the years, that mission has changed as we have realized that the needs of the melanoma community have also changed. So back in 1996, when the foundation was founded, it was really focused on just that, funding research. But today, our mission is a tripartite mission. So we not only fund research and scientific initiatives to find a cure for melanoma, but we educate and empower the melanoma community. And our footprint is very large. We're a national foundation, but we're based here in Washington, D.C. And we have amazing advocates all over the country working in their own hometowns to really help the melanoma community and change the issues that are impacting us. So I'm going to start off and touch on each of our different mission pillars and give you a little bit more information about the various activities that the MRF is engaged in. So we'll start with research. And to date, the MRF has granted over $20.4 million in research grants to academic institutions across the United States. But our research agenda is far broader than just research grants. We also focus on the rare subtypes, so ocular, mucosal, and pediatric melanoma. And just this past May of 2021, we launched the first ever patient-powered vision registry for ocular melanoma patients. It's the first of its kind registry where patients can put in their own data, which will help advance the medical community towards finding a cure for this rare disease. We also have scientific initiatives and workshops. Also in 2021, we hosted our third Brain Metastases Summit. As many of you know, brain metastases is a very challenging problem for the melanoma scientific community. We also have a breakthrough consortium, and that map you see at the bottom of the screen highlights the 22 academic centers who are all working together on major scientific projects, all led by the Melanoma Research Foundation. And here's a pitch for all of you who are now involved in our advocacy days that you can participate in science. There are many opportunities where you can engage with the MRF to either review research grants or find ways that you can participate in clinical trials. So I would encourage all of you to visit our website, melanoma.org, and hit participate in science to find out ways where you can get more involved. The second pillar of the MRF's mission is education, and we have a very wide educational platform. We not only have free educational materials. From 2020 to date, we've given out over 65,000 free educational materials, to academic centers, local dermatology practices, and doctors' offices all over the country. These are all free of charge, and we're generously sponsored by our industry partners so that we can send them out in unlimited quantities all across the United States. We also have webinars, and most recently you might have seen our KimTrack webinar that was put out about 2 weeks ago now and is also available on the MRF website. This was a monumental moment in the uveal melanoma community with the first ever FDA approved drug. So the MRF brought in leading experts to talk about this new treatment option and what it means for patients. We also have many different educational webinars that you can view online if you missed any when we originally sent them out. These are on our on-demand library. Another amazing educational program is our animated melanoma patient videos. These are 2 to 3 minute videos that take very complex medical concepts and distill them down to 2 to 3 minute animations. These are great for patients as well as the wider community. And lastly, our patient and caregiver symposia. These are held all over the country at leading academic centers. But due to COVID, we now have a more hybrid model. So I would encourage you all to visit our Education Institute to learn more about a symposia happening near you. So last, but certainly not least, is advocacy, the reason you are all here today. And again, we want to give a big thanks to everybody who's joining us. Our advocacy program is really about training and empowering our advocates. As you can see the great picture there, that was the last time we were all on the Hill in 2019. But we really provide this amazing opportunity every year for our advocates to come out and gather. And even though we're virtual, that does not mean you have any less of an impact. Our advocacy program is extremely dynamic, and we always offer opportunities for our advocates to join in on calls to action or really important issues that we can lend our voice to. Most recently, we signed on to a letter where President Biden is reinvigorating the Moonshot program. So this letter was with other cancer organizations advocating for this program and really vouching our support for this increased funding for cancer. We also offer many opportunities for our advocates to engage with our program throughout the year. So this might mean speaking on a panel, it might mean participating in a survey, or something very exciting was our FDA listening session held in 2019 with our uveal melanoma patients, clinicians, and caregivers, which was really impactful and played a huge part in leading to the recent FDA approval for KimTrack. So we're really excited to engage our advocates in many different ways, many different opportunities, and really today is a first step in your journey, really, to become an advocate and use your voice. So thank you again. So a brief overview of the MRF's advocacy priorities. So we have 4. The first is research, and over the next couple of days, you'll learn a lot about our research agenda and what we're asking for. Prevention, another key piece in terms of preventing melanoma. And again, you'll hear more about that as the day goes on. Access, this is a huge, huge area. And again, in terms of access, we're really looking at removing barriers to healthcare, removing barriers to accessing Medicare or Medicaid, or accessing a clinical trial or an affordable drug. And this is a really big issue. And we do a lot of sign-ons with many different cancer organizations to help remove access issues for patients. And then lastly, education. This is really an extension of our Education Institute, but educating advocates on the issues that are most important and how they can use their voice to inspire change. So now you might be asking, what are we going to be asking for? So over the next 4 days, there are 4 key issues that we're going to be addressing with lawmakers. And you'll learn more about these when we talk to Ed, our lobbyist, who will be sharing some tips and tricks, as well as experts from the MRP program. So the first is funding for defense-funded research through the Melanoma Research Program, or the MRP. That's an acronym you'll hear a lot about. So this year, we're asking to hold fast at the 40 million in defense-funded research, and we're going to be providing a lot of information to you all on what that means. The second is the NCI NIH. So this is melanoma-specific language that we would like included in the NCI committee report, as well as funding levels. The third is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, skin cancer prevention activities. Again, this is really a funding request and really critical to our prevention capabilities. And lastly, the Food and Drug Administration's rule banning use of tanning beds by teens. Again, such an important issue as we look at prevention. So now that you have a good idea of who the MRF is, what our advocacy platform is, and what we'll be asking for this week, I just want to share a little bit of housekeeping, as this is a virtual program. So if you have a question during any session, we want you to use the Q&A box. For any general comments to all the participants, we want you to use the chat feature. And to also let you know that we will be taking breaks throughout the morning. So we'll be letting you know when those breaks are going to happen. But overall, we really want our advocates to enjoy this week, enjoy this experience, and really utilize social media to share how your meetings are going, what you're learning, and also what you're saying to lawmakers. And you can do that all by tagging the MRF's social media handles. They're all listed here for you. And we're going to use the hashtag MRF Advocacy Days. So with that, I am now going to introduce MRF Science Officer Robin Burns to kick off our first session this morning. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Burns, the Melanoma Research Foundation Science Officer. I'm excited to moderate our first panel session, Recent Advances in Melanoma Care, How Increased Research Investment Has Expanded Options for Patients. I'm joined today by two leaders in melanoma care, Drs. Laura Ferris and Michael Pastel. We'll start our session by looking at advances in melanoma care from a dermatology perspective with Dr. Ferris. Dr. Laura Ferris is a professor of dermatology at the University of Pittsburgh and a member of the UPMC Hillman Cancer Center Melanoma Program. She directs the Pigmented Lesion Clinic and is the Director of Clinical Research for the Department of Dermatology. Her melanoma interests include early detection of skin cancer through screening and the use of technology. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Ferris.
Great, thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about early detection of melanoma, why it matters, some of the advances we've seen in technology, and how we can do it better. Just to give you a brief overview of melanoma, melanoma is a malignancy that almost always primarily starts in the skin. There's also uveal melanoma that starts in the eye. Since I'm a dermatologist, I'm going to focus on melanoma of the skin. If you look here, we can see in the light green boxes that the rate or incidence of melanoma has been going up and up and up over time. Unfortunately, what you see on the bottom is that our death rate has actually stayed pretty consistent as well. Now, if you look hard, you'll see that there's actually, in just recent years, we've started to see that line dip slightly, and that is because of some of the amazing advances we've seen in the treatment of advanced melanoma that you'll be hearing about later. But melanoma is a growing problem. About 2.3% of all people will be diagnosed with melanoma in their lifetime. The median age at diagnosis is 65. So this is a disease that actually affects quite a wide range, but about half of people who are diagnosed with melanoma are diagnosed before age 65 and the other half over 65. There were over 100,000 new cases of melanoma diagnosed in 2021, and that accounts for 5.6% of all cancers. Over 7,000 people died of melanoma last year, and that's about 1.2% of all cancer deaths. This is just to give you an idea of what melanoma looks like. We talk about the A, B, C, D, E's. So this is usually a pigmented lesion on the skin. It can be black or brown. It can also be red or pink. We see that these lesions tend to be asymmetric. Their borders are irregular. They often have more than one color. We think about diameter as being greater than the size of a pencil eraser, although as our ability to diagnose melanoma has improved, we actually are finding much smaller tumors. And then the E is for evolving or changing. So a lesion on the skin that's changing. Other things that we look for is something called regression, which is a lesion that was black starting to turn to white. And then finally, we look for what we call the ugly duckling. So the one mole on the skin that doesn't look like all the others. Just to go over very briefly, melanoma staging. So we talk about stage 0 or in situ melanoma, where it's just sitting at the top of the skin, it hasn't become invasive, or stage 1 melanoma, where it's just beginning to invade into the top layers of the skin. In stage 2 melanoma, we think about melanoma that's gone deeper into the skin. When we talk about stage 3 melanoma, we're talking about melanoma that has spread to the draining lymph nodes. So it's spread beyond the skin and into lymph nodes. And then stage 4 melanoma is melanoma that's gone beyond this and has gone to organs like the lungs or the liver or the brain. Now, this is important because when we think about survival, we think about a patient's stage, and we know that a higher stage is associated with a poorer survival. So we can see here in this green box, we're looking at what percentage of patients survive for 10 years. And we can see if you're diagnosed with melanoma in situ, the very thinnest melanoma at the top, basically all those patients are going to be alive in 10 years or they will not have died from melanoma. However, if we look at late stage 4 melanoma, this is a little older survival curves. What we really were looking at was most patients would not survive for 10 years. This is looking at some updated data on 5-year relative survival. And this is just by if the melanoma has spread. So localized, meaning it was just located in the skin at diagnosis. In 5 years, you would expect over 99% of those patients to still be alive. If you have regional spread, such as to the lymph nodes, you would expect 68% of those patients to still be alive in 5 years. And that number goes down to about 30% for patients with distant metastases. So kind of the take-home message here is finding melanoma earlier is associated with better survival. So as a dermatologist, I really think of that as the most important thing I do every day when I go into work. So sometimes it's really easy. I think anybody would look at these lesions on the skin and say, boy, that looks atypical. I need to see a doctor for that. So we really don't want to find melanoma at this stage. We're not putting our resources and energy to finding these, and these were both advanced melanomas. We want to find them. These are actually melanomas. They're both very early. That's really challenging. These don't look particularly bad. So I think one of the important things we need to focus on is how do we find more melanomas at this early stage? And one of the things that's so hard in teaching patients or nurses or physicians how to identify melanoma is it can have so many different appearances. These lesions all look different from each other. They're all melanomas, and these are all relatively more advanced melanomas. Again, we want to find them before they look like this. So how can we improve early detection? There's a couple strategies. One is just better public education to make sure that our patients seek attention early. I'd rather see a patient who comes in with this flat, irregular lesion than one who comes in with this big tumor that's been growing and ulcerating. The patient on the left is going to do much better, have a much greater chance of survival than the patient on the right. So making sure patients are aware of melanoma. And one of the studies we did in Pittsburgh, we found that one of the greatest predictors of patients coming in with late stage melanoma or thicker melanomas was simply stating that they had never heard of it before they were diagnosed. So we want everybody to know what melanoma is and have a basic idea of what they should be on the lookout for. And then 2, we want to improve early detection. So we want to be able to find lesions early and accurately, particularly as healthcare professionals. The reason why I say that public health is important is that about half of all melanomas are initially detected by the patient. Now, we know that patient-detected melanomas tend to be thicker, meaning they've invaded deeper into the skin, and they tend to be at a later stage than physician-detected melanomas. So there's room to improve on patient detection, but because half of all melanomas are found initially by the patient, patient education is incredibly important here. But we also think physician screening has an important role. As a dermatologist, this is a big part of what I do. We frankly don't have the dermatology workforce, however, in the United States for all screening to be done in a dermatologist's office. We also know that not all patients are equally likely to seek screening or to seek care from a dermatologist. We do know, however, that many more patients do have a primary care physician. So one of the questions we try to answer at UPMC, where I work, is can we give primary care providers who are seeing far more patients throughout our system than our dermatologists the skills to identify melanoma and then empower them to offer a skin check to their patients who are 35 or older, trying to get on the early end of that median age of diagnosis of 65. And can we ask them to look at their skin once a year when they're in the office for a routine checkup? So we developed a module that they could take online. They could get CME credit for taking this. And then we changed our medical record so that they were prompted when they saw a patient once a year who was 35 or older to consider offering them a skin cancer screening. We could then use our electronic health record to go back and look at which patients were screened, which ones are not, and then look at the melanomas diagnosed in those two different populations, the screened population and the unscreened population. So what we found was that compared to melanomas in patients who were not screened, the patients who were screened were more likely to have the very thinnest non-invasive or in situ melanomas. And when they had invasive melanomas, they were thinner overall. So, we think about patients who have a melanoma as being 0.8 millimeters or thicker as being eligible for a lymph node biopsy, meaning we need to subject them to a procedure to see if that melanoma has spread to their lymph nodes. And the risk of that being positive goes up with thickness. So a 0.4 millimeter melanoma, which was the average thickness we saw in the melanomas in the screen group, has a lower risk of having spread to the lymph nodes than does a 0.6 millimeter melanoma. We also looked at all the patients diagnosed with melanoma and said, how many of these patients would be recommended or eligible for a lymph node biopsy? And it was only 6% of those patients who were in the screen group, but it was 21% of those in the group who had not been screened. So we really think that, in addition to carrying a better prognosis, we hope that by early detection, we're going to have to subject fewer patients to procedures such as lymph node biopsies. And unfortunately, in the United States, we actually do not have good guidelines or recommendations for skin cancer screening. So the United States Preventive Services Task Force has reviewed the data on screening, and they have concluded that we really don't have sufficient evidence to balance the benefits and harms of a skin cancer screening in adults. So we really feel that, research to show the value of screening, to understand, is screening truly valuable? Are there harms to screening? And which patients might benefit the most from screening is so important so that we can develop guidelines and make sure that we target this intervention to those patients who would benefit the most. Now I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about technologies to help improve melanoma early detection. One of the things that we do for our very high-risk patients who may have lots and lots of moles or nevi, it's really hard to find that needle in the haystack of the one lesion that's not a benign mole, it's a melanoma, is we actually do full body photography. And this helps us to find, by having a baseline set of images, when patients come into the office, we can pull those up and we can look, and if we see something suspicious on the skin, we can say, was that there 2 years ago when we did our baseline photographs, or has it changed in 2 years? So one of the hallmarks of cancer is it doesn't stay stable over time. It grows, it changes. So this is a way for us to get a baseline, because a patient like this who has hundreds to thousands of moles isn't going to remember what each one looked like. So this is very time consuming. It's subjective. You have to have a set of photos and pull them up and use your eyes and try to look at each one and see if it's changed. One of the areas of research and something that's been worked on is, can we use computers to help us do this? So if we have this patient who has their baseline imaging on the left, for example, and then we have them, we take a new picture. With the technology we have available now, we can do things like match up each individual mole, and this can be used to find, you know, the one mole that's new or the mole that's most changed. So this is the kind of technology that's really promising that could be done on a larger scale. This is also something, these photos can be taken over time. They don't just have to be taken in the office of a dermatologist. These could be done in other centers. So this is, you know, for example, at a primary care physician's office, or, you know, you even need somebody like a nurse. You don't need a physician to take them. You need a physician to review the photos. So this might be a way to really reach more patients. The other tool we use is something called a dermatoscope. It's a handheld instrument that we use to look at lesions on the skin. It magnifies the lesion. It gives us a light source that lets us look at deeper structures in that mole and under the skin, and makes the skin, the top of the skin, translucent. So we see things that you just can't see with the naked eye. And we know from multiple studies that diagnostic accuracy in people who are trained and experienced in the use of dermoscopy is increased. And this is just an example. So, you know, on the top here, the smaller image, that's just what you'd see with your naked eye. This is just a plain photograph of a lesion. You can see here that taken through the lens of a dermatoscope, that we see all these different features that to somebody who's trained in the use of this says, that's an atypical pigment network, or that cutoff of the pigment at the edge of the lesion is concerning. So this helps us to make a better diagnosis. Again, this takes time, this takes a lot of training. And so, you know, one of the questions is, you know, do we need only to have people who have a trained eye, either with their naked eye or with dermoscopy, or can we use computers to help us in this? So there have been several studies that have looked at this over the past several years. So this is one that was published in the very prestigious journal Nature. This was trained on over 100,000 skin lesion images, and actually multiple skin diseases. This study just focused on looking at skin lesions that were either benign or represented a skin cancer. And so what they did was they trained a computer. They said, here is a large series of images that are of skin cancer. Here is a large series of images that are of benign or harmless skin lesions. Train yourself how to take a new lesion and look at that and say, this looks more like the cancers, this looks more like the benign lesions. And so they developed this classifier, and then they tested it against dermatologists. And so for each lesion that they showed, these were lesions that had been biopsied, so they knew the ground truth. They knew, was this actually benign? Was this actually malignant? And so what you can see here is they tested it on images that were just like the smaller picture I showed you, just a photograph of a skin lesion, and then also lesions that were taken through the lens of a dermatoscope. And what we can see here is the blue is the performance of the computer. The red dots are individual dermatologists, and the green cross is sort of if you averaged the all dermatologists that were in the study. And so red dots that fell below the curve are dermatologists who were outperformed by the computer. Red dots that are shown above the blue curve are dermatologists who outperformed the computer. So what we can see here is actually the computer outperformed on this series of lesions most dermatologists. So this suggests that using computers assisted diagnosis really may be a way to improve our ability to to diagnose individual lesions, make a decision, is this likely to be cancer and should it be biopsied? Now, this was so promising that actually several groups have done it. And this is a study that was from a large contest, actually, that was put on using dermatoscopic images. A bunch of different groups were given the opportunity to enter a contest and compete against each other to see who could make the best program. And they also had over 500 dermatologists, or people who diagnose skin cancer across different countries, who were competed against the computer algorithms. And it turned out that if they looked at the top 3 algorithms, they were actually more accurate than the dermatologists. So in these very challenging set of lesions, the dermatologists correctly identified about 73% of melanomas, whereas the computer identified 82%. So, how might we use this? Does this mean we don't need dermatologists? We've got a computer that's going to do it? No, not really. We're really not there yet. We also, these work on a single lesion, but if somebody has to identify that lesion as suspicious in the first place, but it might help us to triage patients. So this was yet another system that was tested. And basically what it does is it takes just a photograph of the lesion and either says it's suspicious or it's not. If it's not, the patient didn't have to see a dermatologist. They could be reevaluated by their primary care doctor in a year. If it was suspicious, then a dermatoscopic image was taken, and that could be evaluated. And then if it was moderate or high risk, then that patient could see a dermatologist and have a biopsy. And it turned out that by doing this triage, that you picked up 90% of melanomas with also what we call a specificity, which is, do you correctly call benign things benign? If you call everything melanoma, that's not helpful. And that specificity was really high at between 85 and 89%. So there's other ways to do this besides just with imaging. This is a device that has been that is available. It's not widely used, but it uses a totally different property of tumors, which is how they conduct electricity through them. And so it's based on the properties of the cells, how they're organized. A benign mole is going to conduct electricity through it in a different way than a melanoma. And so this is a device that uses something called electrical impedance spectroscopy. And this can identify, in this study, it identified 97% of melanomas correctly as being malignant and 35% of non-melanomas as being benign. Another tool we can use is something called gene expression profiling. So this is actually looking at the genetics of a lesion on the skin, and this can be collected non-invasively. So you can see here a piece of tape that is put over the top of a skin lesion. And from that, you can harvest shed genetic material, so DNA and RNA. And from that, you look at for the expression of certain genes. So there are going to be genes like this one in the blue that are going to be expressed at high levels in a benign lesion, but really at lower levels in a cancer. And then by contrast, there'll be genes like this one in yellow that are expressed at high levels in a cancer, but really not at all or at very low levels in a benign lesion. So by going and looking for the presence of one of these genes, you can say, this is likely to be cancer, this is likely to be benign. So this is a test that's available that can, again, with this piece of tape, can look for 3 different melanoma genes within a lesion. And it turns out that if you look at in the studies across a series of melanomas, 97% of them expressed one or more of those 3 genes. So meaning if you see the expression of one of those genes, that is suggestive of melanoma. That's a lesion that should be biopsied. By contrast, 48% of all non-melanomas were negative for all 3 tested melanoma genes. So that meant that if you saw that none of the genes were positive, then you could safely just monitor this. You did not have to do a biopsy. And so this had what we call a negative predictive value of over 99%. So 99% of lesions that had no gene expression were benign. So this is a way to try to get genetic information about a lesion to determine if it's likely to be melanoma and if it should be biopsied. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit about melanoma prevention. So I think most people are, I think we've done a good job of telling people the sun and UV radiation from the sun is one of the big causes of skin cancer. So there are lots of ways to avoid UV light, including sitting in the shade, wearing sun protective clothing, and avoiding peak sun hours. This was a study that actually looked at using sunscreen as an intervention. So patients were counseled either in blue to apply sunscreen every day to their exposed skin, or in yellow, they were just told, do whatever you normally do to protect yourself. The blue group was actually given sunscreen along with the instructions. And so if you look here and see who developed melanoma after the intervention ended, which was a little over 4 years of intervention, and they followed them, it turns out that the melanomas in the group who were not provided sunscreen, that rate was actually higher. So sunscreen actually reduced the risk of melanoma by 50%. It reduced the risk of invasive melanomas, so a little bit more advanced melanomas, by 73%. And the average depth of invasive melanomas was actually thinner in the sunscreen group than in the control patients. So I think this is really good evidence that sunscreen works. But people unfortunately are not just getting they're not just getting melanoma from the sun. We're unfortunately also getting it from things like tanning beds. So this is intentional use. So legislation can play an important role here. In 2013, New Jersey actually banned tanning among youths under age 17. And then later studies were done in 2018 by questionnaires and asking youths about their use of tanning beds. It turned out that tanning by the group who was targeted was reduced by 48% in 2018 versus 2012. And this number was actually over 70% for high school girls who were 17 and older. So this intervention didn't just reduce tanning among the group it was intended to protect. It actually created a culture of not promoting tanning that resulted in better behavior, safer behavior, even among older teens and high school students. So what do we need to do to keep the future bright? One, we hope to improve access to melanoma screening for high-risk patients and also improve education among other healthcare providers. Two, we'd like to use technology to improve our early detection of melanoma and find new ways to do this. Melanoma prevention is incredibly important, whether it's through UV light or even through medical interventions such as supplements or medications that will help to prevent melanoma. We haven't really found the holy grail yet, but that's an incredibly important area of research. And then finally, UV light protection, especially for kids, because the UV light that you get early is particularly damaging. This can be done through tanning legislation, and then also making sure that kids have access to and the ability to apply sunscreen at school. Thank you.
That was a great start to our session, Dr. Ferris. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, for a look at advances in melanoma care from an oncology perspective, let's hear from Dr. Pastel. Dr. Michael Pastel is a medical oncologist and the chief of the Melanoma Service at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He led the first randomized trial of combination immunotherapy with ipi-nivo, resulting in FDA approval of the combination. He has also written and presented on topics related to immunotherapy outcomes and side effects, and studied new ways to combine immunotherapy with local treatments such as radiation. His completed and ongoing work continue to impact cancer patients and advance immunotherapy for melanoma and other diseases. He enjoys skiing, outdoor activities, and trying to keep up with his 2 toddlers and his triathlete wife. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Pastel.
Thank you very much, Robin. I really appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to speak with everybody today. And I don't do very well keeping up with my toddlers or triathlete wife, if anyone was curious. Been struggling with that for a long time. Anyway, I wanted to share some really optimistic and uplifting news in the treatment of advanced melanoma. And I think we heard a great talk about treatment and diagnosis of early stage melanoma by Dr. Ferris previously. But a lot of what I deal with as a medical oncologist has to do when melanoma spreads from its original site in the skin, usually, to other places in the body, whether it be a lymph node or to a distant organ inside the body. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we're thinking about melanoma that has spread to different places in the body and how we're giving treatments that go through the whole body, because once melanoma has spread from one place, usually in the skin, to somewhere else, it's important to think about ways that we can approach the entire body with treatment that goes through the whole system. So with that in mind, I'll give my disclosures. These are for various funding opportunities with mostly pharmaceutical companies to run clinical trials at my institution, and some support that I get from participating in advisory boards to discuss programs within some of these companies. So for our brief outline for what we'll talk about in this talk on advanced melanoma, I wanted to focus on 3 major updates and areas of melanoma therapeutics. Number 1, immunotherapy. Number 2, treatment for patients that have a BRAF mutation in their melanoma, and we'll talk about what that is, but it's often referred to as targeted therapy, directed against the BRAF mutation that's present in about half of patients with melanoma. And then UvealMelanoma is a different kind of melanoma that doesn't come from the skin, but it actually comes from the back of the eye, and it has a very different biology than skin melanoma. It's treated in some ways, sometimes the same as skin melanomas, but we believe it to be different biologically. And there's been a major new advance in uveal melanoma that we'll talk about at the end of the talk. So as Dr. Ferris mentioned, historically, the survival from advanced melanoma was very, very poor. However, what I would be here to tell you about today is these are really old statistics. And the statistics that you see here with this survival curve, which really showed in the past, patients with advanced melanoma, and this was a publication from 2008, so well over a decade ago, advanced melanoma was a fatal disease in the past. And due to a lot of these new therapeutics, thankfully, a large number of patients will have long-term survival with good responses to treatment with advanced melanoma. So this is not the bad disease that the years past advanced melanoma had been. The therapeutics can work incredibly well. And when I see a patient with advanced melanoma that's newly diagnosed, I think it's very important to be very hopeful that the treatments can work well and people can have excellent long-term survival. So in 2022, many patients will have long-term survival with a lot of these drugs, and many of the statistics that are out there online are a lot of old statistics, just as you had seen. So a lot of reasons to be optimistic with what's being developed. So what happened? How did we get to the point where well over 10 years ago, melanoma was almost a nearly fatal disease when it got to its advanced stage. But now many patients can live with this for a very long time and live incredibly well and productive lives that you would see people on the street and you would have no idea that they even ever had melanoma. They're people going about their lives feeling great. They may have had some treatment in the past or are on treatment now, but doing incredibly well. So what happened and where are we going next, most importantly? How do we think about the treatments that we're doing to advance the field so that everyone can have a good response? And so in thinking about that, I wanted to introduce the concept of immunotherapy as a first part of this 3-part talk. Number 1, I think when we think about how cancer treatments work and how immune therapy works, it's important to think about historically chemotherapy, which is different than immune therapy. Chemotherapy affects dividing cells, and that cancer was believed to be a disorder of dividing cells, meaning a normal cell divides from 1 to 2 cells and 2 to 4. And if the cell realizes there are problems within it, it undergoes what's called programmed cell death or apoptosis, where the cell would destroy itself, self-destruct, so that the cancer cell would not propagate and make more cancer cells. And that traditionally we felt that cancer is a disorder of dividing cells, where a cell is abnormal genetically, and it just keeps dividing and dividing and dividing, and it creates a tumor because it's not sensitive to its own, it doesn't realize that it has a problem, and it just keeps propagating itself. And so chemotherapy, when we think about chemo for treating cancer, most of those drugs affect dividing cells and the process of cell division. And so for many, many years, cancer was treated with chemotherapy. And in melanoma, it can help some people, but it was showing that it wasn't as good as we wanted it to be. And so in the development of immune therapy arose from this recognition that instead of just attacking the division of cells, what chemotherapy had done, immunotherapy builds the own body's immune response against the cancer cells. And we all are familiar with our own immune systems, and that the immune response can be used to fight off bacteria, fight off viruses. A lot in the news with COVID about immune responses against the virus being different in many different types of patients, and immune responses against melanoma and other cancers are very different. This is a picture of a cytotoxic T cell, which is a certain type of an immune cell coming in contact with a cancer cell and trying to kill it. So our body has this army within it, and we seek and destroy cancer cells that shouldn't be in there, just like we seek and destroy bacteria and viruses that shouldn't be in there either. And so how do we really think about this, and how does the immune cell really work? It's really about getting T cells, like I just showed on that last slide, into a tumor and to kill the tumor. And so if we think about, well, how do we get T cells into a tumor and kill the tumor? That's all what immune therapy is about. And this is a picture of a tumor, and there are T cells that are present within them. The tumor cells are all kind of on the top. They look a little funny. I know it's a little hard to visualize this, but think about these little fried egg kind of cells look like the tumor cells. And on the bottom, these little purple dots are infiltrating lymphocytes into the tumor. So the idea is that this army, which is shown on the bottom, all these little purple cells are kind of infiltrating into the tumor, what you see at the top. And we need those T cells to kill and destroy the tumor. And that's what we're trying to do with immune therapy. So here's a cartoon depicting this a little bit, and I'll explain kind of why the immune response doesn't normally just get rid of melanoma in patients. Why do we even have melanoma develop in the first place in the advanced setting? And the idea is that if this is the tumor, since melanoma arises from normal melanocytes, which are little cells within the skin that produce pigment, sometimes these tumors are hard for the immune system to see, in that because tumors come from our normal body tissue, they're sometimes kind of resemble normal healthy tissue, and our immune responses are intended not to react against normal healthy tissue, or we would have autoimmune disease. And so since cancer comes from normal healthy tissue originally, although it's genetically different as it evolves, the immune system does not always recognize cancer as something foreign. And so what we want to do with immune therapy is say to the immune system, wake up, go fight the cancer, get rid of it, and recognize it as something different. And so this is showing that within the tumor cells in a normal healthy person, you can see that these little red triangles are kind of cartoon description of showing that the antigens that the tumors express, which are kind of abnormal proteins, they look different from normal cells, and therefore we should be able to mount an immune response against these tumor cells, which are recognized as foreign. So if the immune system fights against foreign invaders, we want to make sure with immune therapy that melanoma, which is something that we shouldn't have in our bodies, but that sometimes is hard for the immune system to seek and destroy, is able to be sought and destroyed. And so that's what immune therapy is all about. And once it's recognized as foreign, the T cells, like I showed before, that were fighting that melanoma cell, they get into the tumor microenvironment, and then through release of a number of different factors, seek and destroy the tumor cells. And so one of the strategies that we use in immune therapy to help these T cells fight the tumor cells better is something called immune checkpoint inhibition. And immune checkpoint inhibition is where you take a T cell and you make it work harder against fighting the melanoma cells. And T cells are normally stimulated by various stimulators. Think of it as like the pedal on your car when you hit the gas. And those are those on the left side, and you can stimulate a number of these different co-receptors on the T cell to cause them to be better melanoma fighting cells. Or you can inhibit the negative signals, or taking the brake off of the car, which essentially is what has been shown to be very successful in melanoma, blocking these targets like CTLA-4 with drugs like UvealMelanoma, or PD-1, drugs like nivolumab and pembrolizumab, or most recently, and I'll talk about this in a minute, LAG-3 with a new drug called Retravalumab, which is not yet FDA approved, but FDA approval, the decision on that is expected in the next month or so. So the idea here is if you disable the brakes on T cells, then you will make them drive faster. And so the idea is that this will enhance these T cells getting into the tumor microenvironment and killing melanomas. And that's been a strategy that's shown remarkable success in patients with melanoma. This is a curve from a phase 3 study that was testing checkpoint blockade, blocking those brakes, as I said, with either CTLA-4 blockade alone, ipilimumab, or PD-1 blockade with nivolumab, and pembrolizumab is another PD-1 checkpoint antibody that shows exactly the same results as nivolumab. This study also had the combination of nivolumab plus ipilimumab, or blocking 2 different brakes on a T cell. And this shows that a good group of patients, about a third of patients, will have no progression of their melanoma treatment after many years of treatment with these checkpoint blocking antibodies. So this is not 100%. We want 100% of people not to have any changes with their melanoma in a negative way over time, but at least it shows that a good proportion of patients can have great long-term benefits with this. And the fact that this curve is flat over time really suggests that once you get to a couple of years since starting treatment, if you're doing pretty well with the melanoma, the expectation is that patients will continue to do well with the melanoma. So that leads to the possibility maybe some of these patients could be in this long-term response or long-term remission, depending on what kind of terminology you want to use, and can do incredibly well many years after beginning treatment. Now, of course, there's some side effects when you boost an immune response, like what I've been talking about. The immune system should be trying to fight against that melanoma that it recognizes as foreign, but sometimes it fights against normal healthy tissue because it gets a little distracted and maybe the immune system is boosted too much. And any organ in the body can be inflamed by some of these treatments. This is a cartoon from a publication a few years ago, a review article talking about the immune therapy side effects that patients can have. And in many situations, I kind of describe this to patient as any organ in the body can have some inflammation with these drugs. And when the inflammation happens to a normal healthy organ that causes a side effect, it can be anything from an itchy rash to achy joints to some diarrhea to lowering of the thyroid function when the thyroid gets inflamed. But any organ in the body can be inflamed, and it's important that you talk with your doctors about symptoms that you might be having so that you can come up with a good treatment strategy to mitigate these symptoms and reduce the problems from the side effects of immune therapy. This is a picture of a patient I took care of a few years ago that had a rash from immune therapy. And a lot of these times the rash is red and itchy, and you can put topical steroid cream like hydrocortisone cream or triamcinolone cream on them and make it better. But it's important to acknowledge that this can happen. Diarrhea and colitis can happen, which is inflammation of the bowels. This is a picture from a colonoscopy view of the inside of a colon on the right, which is showing a lot of swelling and friable tissue in the bowel of a patient that had immunotherapy that had developed this inflammatory side effect. And I think one of the interesting components of this side effect is that we're trying to learn why certain side effects happen in some patients and don't happen in other patients. And this is a study that we did at Sloan Kettering where we collected patient stool actually and looked at the bacteria that the gut had and tried to decide what kind of different bacteria are present in the gut. In this plot on the left, you don't have to worry about all these different colors, but essentially it just shows some patients that never had colitis or colitis-free had different kinds of bacteria than the patients that eventually got colitis from treatment. And there was a bacteria group called Bacteroidetes that was affected patients with colitis differently, so that the patients that never had colitis had a higher abundance of Bacteroidetes. And so new trials are trying to figure out, well, can you manipulate the bacteria in the gut to try to treat colitis or even prevent colitis or even make immunotherapy work better? And so a lot of those are ongoing, and it's very exciting to see where that field will ultimately rest with more data and more science in that area. So with that in mind, I shared some data about the CTLA-4 and PD-1 blockade that really had helped a lot of patients and given people hope for many years of long-term survival. But there's a new checkpoint blocking antibody that's on the stage now, this one targeting LAG-3. It's called Retravalumab, and it hasn't yet been FDA approved, but there was a recent phase 3 study that showed it improved outcomes compared to drugs like nivolumab alone. And the study showed that when you added the Retravalumab to nivolumab alone, something called progression-free survival, which is a proportion of patients living without any negative changes to their melanoma, it showed that this combination improved those outcomes. So we're still awaiting additional data. This is not yet FDA approved, hopefully in the next month or so, we'll find out how the FDA feels about this and whether it will be FDA approved. This could be another option, but I think I bring up this example to show how new strategies for treatment of melanoma continue to raise the bar, help more patients than we had in the past, and hopefully new combinations will continue to ensure that patients can have the best possible outcomes with advanced melanoma. The last two topics I'll talk about in my final few minutes here. One is about what to do if a patient has a BRAF mutation. What is a BRAF mutation and what does it mean and how can it be targeted? And this is another treatment modality for patients with resected stage 3 melanoma and for patients with unresectable stage 3 melanoma or stage 4 melanoma. And the idea here is that BRAF is a protein that exists in a pathway. And normally BRAF is responsive to when there's signals that tell a cell to grow or divide. BRAF is part of that response. But in the setting of when the BRAF mutation is present, that means the cells grow and divide inappropriately. And so there's been a whole field of development of drugs that block BRAF. You may hear about different BRAF inhibitors like vemurafenib or dabrafenib or encorafenib. And those BRAF inhibitors are almost always paired with something that blocks something called MEK, M-E-K, and that would be drugs like binimetinib or trametinib or cobimetinib. And so the combination of BRAF and MEK inhibitors have also been shown to improve long-term survival rates from advanced melanoma. And they block this signaling pathway within the cells that tell the cell to grow and divide. It is a genetic test to get the BRAF testing performed, and it's important to have this done on all patients, in my opinion, with stage 3 and 4 melanoma. However, although it has the word genetics in there, there's nothing inherited about mutations in BRAF. So BRAF mutations are mutations that arise due to genetic abnormalities within the melanoma itself, and they have nothing to do with something that would be inherited from family members. So if you find that your genetic test shows you have a BRAF mutation, this is not something you have to tell your family members that they're at risk for some kind of genetic disorder of some sort. So important to know, even though it's called a genetic test, to test to see if this abnormal gene and therefore protein is present. Don't worry about this with the term genetic. It's not a family type genetic inherited issue. And this is a picture of a PET scan of a patient that had a really dramatic response to BRAF inhibition. This is a baseline PET scan on the left, and you can see all these little black dots in this patient through all the areas where the melanoma had been. And then on day 15, which is only 2 weeks of treatment with BRAF inhibition, a lot of these black dots have completely resolved. So really, really profound type treatment with the BRAF and MEK treatments. And we're still trying to figure out who should get the BRAF and MEK treatments. When should those be given? When should immunotherapy be given? I think for advanced melanoma, usually immune therapy is given first, but there's a lot of questions and debate, and it's important to talk with your doctors. What's the best sequence when you do have a BRAF mutation? And I should mention, these BRAF inhibitors are only for patients with the BRAF mutation. If you don't have the BRAF mutation, the choices are immune therapy. And so important distinction there. Last, I want to close with this major advance in UvealMelanoma. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but when we were talking about the tumor as needing to be recognized as foreign so that the body can go in and seek and destroy it, UvealMelanoma that arises from the back of the eye and usually can spread to the liver or bones, for many, many years, we hadn't found a really good immune therapy strategy to treat UvealMelanoma. And there are a lot of complicated reasons why UvealMelanoma has not been as responsive to systemic immunotherapy like skin melanoma has been. And one of the reasons is because it's not recognized as foreign in the way that we want to have our immune system see the UvealMelanoma within the normal healthy tissue. And so there has been a new strategy that brings T cells into the tumor microenvironment directly. If the T cells, which is the immune response, are not fighting against the melanoma, you're not going to be able to destroy the melanoma or control it. So the idea for UvealMelanoma is because you don't have this good endogenous, which is your own body's ability to fight the melanoma off, let's give it a drug that brings the T cells into the tumors themselves to allow them to do better fighting against the melanoma and then ultimately kill the UvealMelanoma. And here's a picture of UvealMelanoma in the back of a patient's eye. When the doctor shines that light and looks at you very closely, they're looking at the back of your eye called your retina. And this big kind of black spot in the upper left is a UvealMelanoma tumor. And this cartoon on the right shows this new drug that just got FDA approved in January called tebentafusp. And this is a very, very big, exciting update in UvealMelanoma. It's the first drug that's ever been FDA approved for UvealMelanoma. and it has been shown to improve overall survival with patients with advanced uveal melanoma, meaning when the uveal melanoma has spread to somewhere else. Basically, how does it work in a nutshell? And then I'll close and summarize. Uveal melanoma doesn't have a lot of T cells in it for the reasons I talked about before. And essentially this drug has kind of two arms to it. One arm grabs the uveal melanoma cells. The other arm grabs T cells and it juxtaposes them close together. So it's called a T cell redirector or T cell engager. Lots of different terms can be used for this type of an approach, but I just think of it as a matchmaker with two different hands, one arm grabbing the cancer cells, one arm grabbing the T cell, bringing them close together so that the T cell can kill these uveal melanoma tumors. And this is a major advance in uveal melanoma, the first FDA approval ever. The name is a very big tongue twister, tebentafusp, but we can get over that and know that it really helps a lot of patients. So very exciting updates there. In summary, our immune system can be a very powerful way to treat advanced melanoma. Even with a stage 4 diagnosis, people can do incredibly well. Stage 4 just means it has spread somewhere inside. It doesn't mean anything about how will people do with the treatment. And so ultimate prognosis, in my opinion, is based on responsiveness to these treatments. So if you have a new diagnosis of stage 4 melanoma or you're under treatment, have a lot of hope that this can really be helpful for you. If you have a BRAF mutation, and only if you have a BRAF mutation, targeted therapy can be an option for you, and it's important to talk to your doctor about what might be most appropriate. And lastly, uveal melanoma finally can be successfully treated. So it's a huge advance, and I think opening the book on a whole new world of being able to now treat the traditionally more difficult types of melanoma to treat, like uveal melanoma. And with that, I'll close. This is a Zoom picture of our melanoma group at Sloan Kettering. Everyone happy in the virtual world, and hopefully now that COVID's improving, we'll see each other in person again sometime soon. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks for that overview of advances in both cutaneous and uveal melanomas, Dr. Pastel. Let's round out this session with a few questions for both Drs. Ferris and Pastel. So we'll start with Dr. Ferris. You mentioned a number of tools for melanoma detection in your talk. Are they all covered by insurance usually?
So that's a good question. Some are not. Dermoscopy is really just a tool that we use as it's like our stethoscope in dermatology. So that isn't something just like that is covered or not. That's just sort of what we do. Some of these tools that are specific to one lesion, some are covered by insurance, some are out of pocket. The genetic test, for example, has insurance coverage. The one that uses the electrical signal across does not. Some of the automated mole mapping actually is not covered by insurance.
Dr. Pastel, in the next 3 to 5 years, what do you envision will be the new targets or combinations for cutaneous melanoma patients?
Absolutely. So I think we have made dramatic strides in the BRAF mutation area for those about 50% of patients. I'm really hopeful that we'll continue to make strides for patients with NRAS mutant melanoma, which is another common mutation in melanoma. So NRAS can be targeted with certain MEK inhibitors with some efficacy there, but I think new combinations will continue to improve the bar there. So I'm really excited about areas in NRAS mutant melanoma, and I'm also excited about new data that we have for adoptive cell therapy or tumor infiltrating lymphocyte therapy for patients that have had prior immune therapy. So I think those two kind of big areas, we're seeing a lot of activity right now, and I'm hopeful that that will help people that have had other standard immune therapy drugs and need some additional treatment thereafter.
Okay, great. And then a follow-up question for you, Dr. Pastel. What do you envision will be the targets, combinations for uveal melanoma? So they just had the first big FDA approval of their drug. Anything else you see on the horizon?
So yeah, that's fantastic news for uveal melanoma, and I think tebentafusp is great. But a couple things to know about tebentafusp, and I'll talk about combinations. Number one, the way that the drug works, it's only for people with a certain type of immune system. So they have to have what's called HLA-A2 in their genetics of their whole body. So it's important if you have uveal melanoma that you ask your doctor to get tested for this genetic marker to help determine if tebentafusp is an option for you. So my hope in uveal melanoma is that we develop drugs like tebentafusp for people with other HLA type statuses so that we can extend that benefit to more patients, because it's only about half of patients that will be candidates for tebentafusp based upon that. But I think if you're a candidate for tebentafusp and the new ways of moving forward are going to be many different combination studies of other immune agents on top of tebentafusp. So that drug, tebentafusp, brings the T cells into the tumor microenvironment. Then you can give checkpoint inhibition, or you give other immune activating agents to help those T cells kill those uveal melanoma tumors even better. So we have kind of a backbone now, and I hope to see more activity built upon that in the future. And I think combinations in uveal will be the way to go.
Great, thank you. Last question, Dr. Ferris. So you mentioned some melanoma screening, and I guess my question was, how can it be improved in community practices? So you talked about the UPMC module that you used in Pittsburgh, and I'm assuming some of the affiliated hospitals. Do you see that sort of being the future for community practices, that sort of a module? And has it been used beyond Pittsburgh, or are there other modules available, or are there other things that you think would help to help screening in the community?
Yeah, so we're certainly not unique in Pittsburgh with our goal of trying to expand screening beyond dermatology into primary care. There's actually several different states that are part of this we call War on Melanoma. And one of the big efforts here is to provide training. So one of the things we need to do is actually study the best way to do that. So is it through an online module? Is it through other educational methods? How often do we need to sort of reorient or retrain people? Are we going to get better success if we have primary care physicians doing skin biopsies? Should we be giving them some of these tools to do things other than, just send out any suspicious lesion to a dermatologist? Can we integrate things like AI into that? So, this is an effort that's going on nationwide. We're just one example of where we've been able to do that and look at our outcomes, but we need to understand better what works and figure out how to take new technology. So while something like a genetic test may be more expensive, or dermoscopy may take years to use, potentially a tool that can very quickly give sort of a triage or feedback on one lesion may be something that could be helpful in the hands of primary care physicians. So this is something that I think we need to do on a national level. I think we also need to be training, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, people who are, in some places they've actually trained hairdressers who are looking at the scalps of oftentimes elderly patients on a regular basis. So I think this is really a team effort.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank both Drs. Ferris and Pastel for joining us today. If you have any questions for either Dr. Ferris or Dr. Pastel, feel free to email them to us at education@melanoma.org.
Great. Good morning, MRF advocates. I'm Doug Brodman, the chairman of the Melanoma Research Foundation Board. I'm beyond ecstatic to welcome each of our melanoma advocates to the 2021 MRF Virtual Advocacy Days. Your voice will help all of us in the melanoma community as you engage with federal lawmakers on policy areas important to us, including funding for the melanoma research through the congressionally directed melanoma research program, which I have had the privilege to participate in as a consumer advocate, as well as general public education, awareness, and prevention. This morning, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the Honorable Carolyn B. Maloney, U.S. Representative for the 12th District of New York, as our 2022 Advocacy Days plenary speaker. Over the years, Representative Maloney has been a powerful voice for the melanoma community and a wonderful supporter of the MRF. To combat the rise of melanoma rates in 2007, Representative Maloney introduced the Tanning Accountability and Notification Act, which required the FDA to amend warning label requirements for sun lamps to include the risks associated with indoor tanning. Representative Maloney has been a tremendous supporter of the Department of Defense-funded melanoma research and the congressionally directed melanoma research program. Please join me in welcoming Representative Maloney delivering remarks as today's plenary on the Congressional Town Hall updates on skin cancer prevention and melanoma research and the importance of advocacy.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm grateful that we are able to come together virtually for such an important cause. As a longtime advocate for skin cancer prevention and the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Skin Cancer Caucus, I want to commend Kaylee Lipera and the Melanoma Research Foundation for its incredible work to eradicate melanoma. I also want to acknowledge Ed Long and the rest of the people who organized this Hill Day for all of your hard work. It is because of your tireless work that these important advocacy days continue to happen and they save lives. Melanoma is something that has been on my radar for a very long time, ever since a young woman, a constituent of mine, came to my office years ago and told me she was undergoing chemotherapy treatment for melanoma. While in her early 20s, she had been a frequent user of tanning beds as a teen and was unaware of its dangers. She became a great advocate against these tanning machines. As this particular audience knows very well, melanoma kills 9,000 people in the US every year. The majority of these cases are preventable, like the case of my constituent who simply hadn't known the astronomical health risks associated with tanning beds. Without sufficient research, outreach, and prevention, this public health crisis will only continue to grow. I have long fought for stronger protections against tanning beds and more education about them, because our nation's young people should not be dying from what is an entirely preventable cancer. In 2006, I authored the TAN Act, a bill to require manufacturers to include warning in their marketing materials and show that their tanning beds meet performance testing requirements. I'm proud to say it was passed into law in 2007 and has resulted in the FDA applying stricter warning labels, including the warning that people under 18 should not use the product on all tanning beds and sun lamp products. But that was only a small step in the fight to eliminate skin cancer through advocacy, research, and prevention. In 2013, I founded the Congressional Skin Cancer Caucus, which I currently co-chair with Representative Jim Cooper, David Joyce, and John Joyce. This bipartisan caucus helps ensure that skin cancer awareness, as well as funding for research, remains a top congressional priority. For fiscal year 2021, we were able to secure $30 million for the peer-reviewed melanoma research program. And I have worked with the Skin Cancer Caucus again to request an additional increase of $10 million to make sure we have the funding necessary for skin cancer research in fiscal year 2022. I also plan to continue the fight to prohibit minors from using tanning beds, as the health risks are too severe and too little known. I first called on the FDA to limit tanning bed use to people 18 years and older in 2015. Toward the end of the Obama administration, and now if you have to be 21 to buy, if you have to be 21 to buy cigarettes or alcohol, it absolutely makes no sense that in some states you can be 13 years old and use a tanning bed. The FDA partially listened to our call to prohibit minors from using tanning beds, and in 2015 they proposed 2 rules to do just that. Unfortunately, the rules were never finalized under either President Obama or President Trump. Currently, 22 states and the District of Columbia prohibit people younger than 18 from using indoor tanning devices. Globally, 13 countries have banned indoor tanning for individuals younger than 18, and 2 countries have banned indoor tanning altogether. It's time that the United States follow suit and prohibit minors from using indoor tanning devices at the federal level. So one of my priorities this Congress, in addition to ensuring sufficient funding for melanoma research and advocacy, is working with the Biden administration and the FDA to finalize these proposed rules. For example, last year I led a letter to the FDA asking them to finalize these rules to prohibit minors from using tanning beds. In response to my letter, the agency wrote that the proposed rulemaking on tanning beds is currently listed as part of the administration's unified agenda with a target date for a final rule of May 22, 2022. Minors should not have access to tanning beds, serious, ever, period. And I will work hard until we have this protection on the books. Thank you again to all of you for your work to bring melanoma into the national spotlight and to ensure that melanoma research, advocacy, and prevention are properly and adequately funded. I am grateful to have you as allies in the fight to eliminate melanoma and protect the health of all Americans. Thank you very, very much. Together we can bring this change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Maloney. On behalf of the MRF, I want to extend our sincerest appreciation to you on behalf of all you do for the melanoma community, but most importantly for the young people out there. You are such an amazing advocate. And today's plenary certainly shows all the wonderful things that you've been doing, advocate on behalf of young people, to protect them from this very preventable cancer. Your continued work as a melanoma advocate is truly an inspiration to us all. Thank you so much again, and we hope to see you in person next year at Hill Day. Great. So now we are going to kick off our next section, which is a panel discussion entitled Access Issues and Using Your Voice to Advocate. And today I'm really thrilled. We're joined by three amazing advocates that we do a lot of work with, who are going to share their expertise with us and experience on this topic. We are joined today by Dr. Richard Carvajal, Laurel Lindstrom Todd, and Kristen Noko. So thank you all for joining us today. We are going to start off by introducing Dr. Carvajal for a discussion on clinical trials. And as many of you know Dr. Carvajal well, he doesn't almost even need an introduction in this community, but to start off, I wanted to share a little bit about him. He is currently the Associate Professor of Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, where he serves as both Director of Experimental Therapeutics and Director of the Melanoma Service within the Division of Hematology and Oncology. He serves as co-leader of the Precision Oncology Systems Biology program. His research is focused on the development of novel therapies for patients with melanoma and other cancers, with an overall objective of controlling and curing these diseases. Dr. Carvajal's melanoma research has included the study and treatment of uncommon clinical and molecular subsets of melanoma, such as uveal, mucosal, and acral. And he has been the principal investigator or co-investigator on over 500 clinical trials, including several investor-initiated multi-center trials, as well as the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program sponsored and industry-supported clinical trials. He serves as the co-chair of the International Rare Cancer Initiative UvealMelanoma Working Group that works to enhance international collaboration in the conduct of clinical trials for uveal melanoma. So today, with Dr. Carvajal's extensive experience with clinical trials, we thought this would be the perfect topic to start with when we're talking about advocating and gaining access to treatments. So Dr. Carvajal, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Kylie. Thank you for doing this. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So let's just start off. There has been a lot of buzz lately, certainly with the first FDA approval of Kimmtrak, which is a drug for uveal metastatic melanoma, first of its kind, really groundbreaking. But for many patients with uveal melanoma, clinical trials were really the only treatment available to them. And clinical trials are many times very confusing to patients. There's a lot of myths out there about clinical trials. So I thought maybe we could kind of start off with the basics and have you explain maybe some of the different phases of a clinical trial that include patient participation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, clinical trials are very, very confusing, but I would just highlight that all of the progress we've made in cutaneous melanoma, ocular melanoma, all melanoma subtypes, all cancers, it's really been made through clinical trials. And these clinical trials are really true partnerships, I think, between the patients, the researchers, and the clinicians, right? And that's how we make the progress. When we do these clinical trials, you can think of it as going on a spectrum of fairly new and very investigational to kind of more established. And I would focus on 3 of the main phases of trials. They're phase 1 trials, phase 2, and phase 3, and that's what most of the folks on the call I think will be thinking about. The phase 1 trials are those where we're taking a drug, and sometimes we're using that drug for the first time in people. It sounds very scary, right? But here we're taking an agent that has worked very well in the lab, shown safety in the animals, and we really have to see, is it really going to be safe in people? And these are the trials where we do that. Now, sometimes it's just one drug that's brand new. Sometimes we're taking 2 old drugs and doing them in a new combination. But the real intent is to say, to figure out what are the right doses, what are the side effects, can we give this safely? I can tell you from a clinician standpoint, when I put patients on even these phase 1 trials, it is to find dose, document safety, but it's really to benefit the patient. And I would highlight that even in these phase 1 trials, we are helping patients. And remember, the initial patients on the Opdivo trials, Keytruda trials, we were doing phase 1 trials of those drugs just 15 years ago. And now they're really the bedrock of how we treat melanoma. Now, the phase 2 trials take the regimen that we identified in phase 1, and we treat a larger number of patients to see, does it work? And it's really to get an estimate of, how well do we think this agent will work in people? And then if it's looking good there, then we'll go to the phase 3 trial. And the phase 3 trials are the big trials that are typically randomized. And something to highlight, because randomization is a scary word. What we do here is we randomize people generally to the new therapy. So one group gets a new therapy, and the other group gets what would be the standard of care. Okay, it's very rare that we do placebo trials in cancer. Everyone is getting at least what the standard of care is. And in these large trials, this is where we're treating big numbers of patients, so we can really prove as definitively as possible that something works and it's better than what we're otherwise able to offer.
Can I ask one question there? Would a patient know if they were receiving the standard of care or the new drug?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the randomization, sometimes the trials are what we call blinded or double blinded. And what that means is that the regimens are given, so it's almost identical. So if it's a study of 2 pills, versus kind of standard of care 1 pill, for instance, there would be a placebo dummy pill in that arm. So everyone would be getting 2 pills. And in those double blinded trials, neither the doctor nor the patient or individual will know what they're getting. Okay, and those are the most rigorous trials that we can kind of design. Sometimes it's just not feasible to do that sort of blinding, and so sometimes everyone will know, what an individual is getting. So I would definitely ask your physician, is it a blinded trial? Will I know what I'm getting?
It's a really, really important question. I think most people would want to know, right?
I think most people would want to know, but why do we do that? Like why do we randomize? Why do we blind? It's really to make sure that the results are as reliable as possible. And it's very hard to understand sometimes, right? Like people will say, why are you going to randomize me to the standard of care? I don't want to get that. I want to get the new drug. But you know what? A lot of times the new drug doesn't work. Right? And maybe really you don't want the new drug.
Yeah. That's a
and
really
that's why we do the study. We just don't know.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that's a really good point, and I think a good kind of segue point into my next question. And how are patients, or how do patients learn about the clinical trials that would be appropriate for them? You know, what are some of the things that they should be maybe asking their doctor? I mean, we have a clinical trial finder through the MRF on our education page. That's great. But, you know, for you as a physician, what are kind of the conversations you're having with your patients? Are you bringing it up? Are they bringing it up? And what should patients be doing?
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously I'm somewhat biased. I do clinical trials for a living, but I think it's fair to say that clinical trials are really part of our, even though they're investigational, they are part of the standard of care of how we should be managing the people we work with cancer, right? We are not curing everyone. Our treatments have way too many side effects. And so even in the cases where we have a treatment that can work well, you know, might be curative, we can always make that better. And so from my perspective, clinical trials should be a part of every single discussion at each decision point that you're having with your physician. Now, there's sometimes when that discussion maybe is a little bit more critical, right? And so you can imagine if someone with melanoma has been treated with checkpoint blockade and with targeted therapies, maybe even chemotherapy, and we're really just running out of things, then clearly we have to talk about what's new out there, you know, what's next. But even in the upfront setting, where we might say, well, look, you know, you've got metastatic disease, we can do the combination of, you know, PD-1 plus CTLA-4, we can cure patients, a lot of side effects. But even there's room for improvement. And even in the upfront setting, I think there's a role for discussion. And so for everyone on the call, I would make sure that if your doctor doesn't bring up the idea of clinical trials, then you should ask, you know, should we be thinking about trials? You know, why might we do it now? Why might we not do it now?
Yeah, absolutely. And bringing, you know, for some people, bringing maybe some information to their doctor to say, hey, do I qualify for this trial? Is this something I should be looking into?
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing if you could do that. You know, there are, you know, I just looked on clinicaltrials.gov, and I think there are about 500 actively accruing melanoma trials.
Yeah.
There's no way your doctor is going to know about all of those. Mm-hmm. Even the melanoma specialists, I don't know all of those trials. And, you know, and so how can we expect our patients to actually know those? It's very hard. So, you know, the more research you can do, the better. And I think that's what organizations like the MRF can be really helpful in saying, well, look, these are some of the priority trials that you should be thinking about. And if patients come with that information, I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-advocating, right?
100%.
So let's talk about access to clinical trials, because I think, again, the title of this panel section is really about access and advocating. So how can patients play a role in expanding access to clinical trials? Is there a role for them?
100%. Of course, there's a role for them, but how do we do it? I guess one thing you have to think about is what are the challenges that we face when companies try to run trials? You know, ideally, patients have access to the trial, you know, through their primary oncologist. But the reality is that any of these trials are only done at select centers because of the logistical difficulties, because of the cost of every time you open up the trial at a new center, there's an added cost. You know, for now, I think, you know, from a realistic standpoint, I would say for anyone dealing with melanoma at this point, if you don't have trials available through your local hospital, local oncologist, I would think about, you know, reaching out to the nearest academic center where they might have a portfolio of trials available, either you or your doctor. And I can say, you know, any of my colleagues were happy to speak with, you know, your local oncologist, you know, yourself over the phone. With the advent of telemed, you know, I think you get access maybe to some maybe more specialized physicians. And that may be worth thinking about in some cases. But in terms of you know, advocating for expansion of trial access, there's a growing movement in what we call decentralized clinical trials. This is very hard to do, and it's not really widespread by any means now. But my hope is that in 5 or 10 years, this may be the case. But imagine that, for instance, if the investigational drug is a pill, why can't the pill be mailed to your home? Why can't we have nurse practitioners or physician assistants travel to your house to do the exams? Why can't we do blood work at your Quest or LabCorp, or have a phlebotomist come to your house to do, the blood draws? So that may be a reality at some point, and there are definitely efforts to do that.
I think that's a really great future innovation, I think, for patients. If you're working full time, there's the whole issue of work life, right? Like you can't travel, you can't be away from your kids, you can't be away from your job. And I think hopefully medicine will get there. And are there ways that patients can advocate for that, or questions they could ask their doctor, in terms of not only local centers, but having some of that done at home? Is that even a possibility now, or is that all future?
It's a possibility for a very small number of trials. So I think it's still very future looking, but I think, as we speak as a field, as patients get opportunities to speak with the FDA, as you did your FDA listening session, as we speak with the industry, I think stressing that access is so critical. We are leaving behind a significant number of people who just cannot travel to the investigator sites to get access to these novel therapies. And that should not be the case. That's not fair. It's not right.
Yeah.
And I think, if we just, keep on amplifying that message, that'll hopefully lead to faster change.
Yeah, it will. Well, thank you, Dr. Harbaugh. Please stay on the line with us while we introduce our other panelists, because we're going to hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So what I'm going to do now is segue to our next panelist, Laurel Lindstrom-Todd. Laurel is with Iovance Biotherapeutics. So we were just talking about trials, where she leads market access and external affairs. Prior to joining Iovance, Laurel was with Insight, and before that, Tesaro, where she established the government affairs and policy functions for both companies. She began her career at Gilead, where she was senior director, responsible for federal policy development and executive branch engagement. Prior to Gilead, Laurel spent nearly 10 years with the biotechnology innovation organization BIO, leading reimbursement and health policy development and advocacy jobs on behalf of established biopharma companies. Prior to BIO, Laurel spent time consulting on federal health policy, where she began in DC, working for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services during implementation of the Medicare Modernization Act, which reformed Medicare Part B reimbursement and established the Part D program. So please join me in welcoming Laurel to our panel.
Thank you, Kylie.
Thanks, Laurel. So lots of good stuff here. And as we sort of build off of Dr. Carvajal's comment on clinical trials, let's talk about once a clinical trial reaches its endpoint and demonstrates that there is benefit to patients. Can you tell us what's the process so that that treatment option is now available to patients outside of the clinical setting?
Absolutely. And there's kind of a continuum of activity that happens in the clinical trial process through FDA review and finally into approval. And so the sponsor of the trial engages with the FDA, hopefully earlier in the process, to understand what are those key elements that might need to be built into the clinical trial design to ensure a swift review later on. As that information comes together, there's different options for how a sponsor can submit their BLA or NDA. And in some instances, there are certain products that can qualify for certain types of pathways within the FDA that give them more frequent and earlier conversations with the FDA that can help expedite review or clinical trial development along the way. Those pathways are things like accelerated approval or breakthrough designation and RMAT designation, regenerative medicine, advanced therapies, that indicate to the market later on and to the FDA kind of what the significant unmet need might be for that specific patient population and indication. And so, you know, in some instances, the FDA not only is reviewing the clinical trial results, but also whatever the complex manufacturing process and product quality evaluation criteria might be. But that's just the FDA clinical trial component. If you know you achieve approval, that does not mean that you're going to have broad patient access on day one. And there's a lot of work that happens at the sponsors prior to approval to try and get the market ready, especially when it's a first-in-class, novel therapy, where developers are also working with, if there's specialized treatment centers that might be delivering the therapy so that they know what's entailed with that. There's working with policymakers to ensure that the payment systems may be ready for that new therapy. There's working with payers and commercial payers in the same way to help educate about what the therapy is. And then also working with key opinion leaders to help them understand and expand awareness outside of the confines of the clinical trials, but to expand so that the market is just aware. In some instances, care may end in one setting because there's not another therapy available in another setting. And so now you need to go and educate the new setting and make sure that the first is talking to the second so that patients and their providers know that there's this new therapy available. We think a lot about trials in the FDA and getting to approval, but we always have to think about what's next beyond that and how can we kind of build that glide path so that we can get that novel therapy to patients who desperately need it.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things I wanted to also touch on is one thing that we hear a lot of in advocacy organizations is people who go on a trial, they have a complete response, right? They have no evidence of disease. It's incredible. But that clinical trial closes and the drug is not FDA approved, right? It's going through the process, which is very frustrating for the patient community because they've seen, whether it's being on an MRF patient forum or reading a blog post from a patient, that this patient had a good response and wow, if this trial was still open, maybe I would qualify. So the patient voice is really important, which we know, especially with the FDA, but the patient voice is really important from a more global perspective overall. So how can patients help advocate so that the treatments do move through the approval process? You know, what would your advice be to those patients out there that are seeing sort of the backlog in the approval process at the FDA? They're frustrated. They know that, you know, that they're not doing well and they need more options. What is your advice to them?
Absolutely. So I think this patient community in particular, but others are aware that there's a couple of different options. One is you can try and go directly to the sponsor and look at what avenues or single patient INDs and that sort of thing may be available, but can be complicated and slow and is not ideal. There's also the opportunity to try and work with the FDA. They have established very specific pathways, I guess, for the patient community to engage with the FDA in a public forum through the patient engagement advisory committees and the patient representative programs. But I think what's less well known is that the FDA has also invited specific feedback and partnership with sponsors to encourage them to reach out to sponsors to say, how can I help? What can I do? And the FDA doesn't necessarily hear in that direct way, and it can, I can imagine, can feel kind of uncomfortable, but when the FDA is asking for it, please, please do it, because that's how you can most directly get your voice in and associated and identified with a specific unmet need. You know, I also want to say that there were those other stakeholders that I mentioned in terms of not just the FDA, but there are others who engage with the FDA in terms of potential treatment centers and KOLs and those types of individuals. But patients also have a voice with all of those other groups on their own in terms of making sure that they understand that exactly what that unmet need is, making sure that the Medicare and Medicaid system are aware, and the policymakers there, they can talk to their congressional leaders. They can talk, importantly, through groups like MRF and other KOL groups, NCCN, ASCO, SITC, ACCC, COA, all of these different groups, MRF, MRA, AIM, all of them have these different opportunities to create an echo chamber for a single patient voice. And when you can raise your hand and say, I can help, how can I help? There are these groups out there that want to hear from you and want to say, what can we do? How can we help? And it's those groups that create that echo chamber that can then influence all of those other stakeholders that have an impact on FDA, CMS, wherever it might be. I do want to follow up on one of the points earlier, and that issue of not being able to access clinical trials because of physical distance or a limited network of providers. I think that's exactly the type of statement that the FDA would appreciate hearing, that they're not, instead of them standing in the way, they have the power to help patients get access, because they may not have access physically to get to that treatment center when the context of the trial may be closed. The FDA is the one who has the power to help expand that and bring it to the patients, and it's the patients in a commercial setting. And it's those patients who can go to the FDA and say, you have this power, you can bring this to us. And I think that is a really important, critical message for the patient community to understand.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And when you were talking earlier about getting a drug to market and all the different stakeholders, one of the things you mentioned was the insurance, right? The reimbursement and the insurance, and all these things have to be worked out once it does get approved. And I want to go back to that because, again, especially with clinical trials, I think there's a lot of confusion. So are clinical trials covered by insurance? Is there a payment from a patient perspective? How is that all handled from the patient side?
Sure. So there's federal law that addresses this, that requires most health insurance plans to cover the routine patient care costs that are associated in clinical trials. The therapy, the experimental therapy itself is generally, the responsibility of the sponsor. But within the context of commercial insurance, there should be coverage. Now, I'm not going to say it's a smooth sailing kind of situation, and a lot of times you have to kind of look up what the clinical trials policy might be for your specific plan. But again, that's where groups who've done this before, MRF, MRA, others, who can really help navigate this. But it does kind of throw it back onto the patient to say, this is what I need. This is what I've got to do. Who can help me do this? And, I think, so that standard of care kind of stuff can get covered, and the experimental therapy itself is not going to have a cost associated with it. But it's a matter of getting to the right person at the right plan at the right time, which is just incredibly frustrating. And also, again, back to why, empowering the FDA to know that they don't have to keep it structured within the trial, and that they are the ones that can help bring this and broaden access to patients. I think the other piece that, I sound like a broken record, but there is such a significant role for patients and their advocates within the policymaking process and federal healthcare programs. And that's a symbiotic relationship between commercial payers and federal payers, where the actions of one are informing the other. And so when patients, a federal healthcare program can be there for the patients, but really who they hear from are different entities and bodies that might have more experience in engaging directly. And it's a wonderful area for patients and their advocates to participate and write letters and participate in comment processes and, stand up and be brave and make comments at an open forum and whatever it may be, to have the opportunity to amplify your voice, because that symbiotic relationship between the different programs can absolutely change and accelerate patient access.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laurel. And hopefully you can stand by. I'm going to segue to our third panelist, Kristen, here, and then we're going to take questions at the end. I think we should have a few minutes for questions, so please put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll get to them at the end. But I want to move forward and talk to Kristen. She is our final panelist, Kristen Nocco, and Kristen has been living with ocular melanoma since February of 2013. She was diagnosed with called a spot on her liver in 2015, which was later found to be metastatic ocular melanoma. In 2019, she opted to participate in a clinical trial at the University of Pennsylvania that she participated in for 22 months. She recently started immunoembolization treatments at Thomas Jefferson University. Kristen very bravely shared her patient story during the MRF's first ever patient-led FDA listening session that was held in January of 2020. It was hosted by the MRF's CureOM initiative, which brought together ocular melanoma patients, caregivers, and providers to provide firsthand accounts of what it's like living with or caring for someone with this rare and sometimes fatal form of melanoma. Dr. Carvajal also participated in this session, which she shared earlier. So Kristen, big thank you for joining us today and offering your insights. I want to just welcome you and start off with a question of why did you feel it was important to participate in the FDA listening session that was held a couple of years ago?
To show our faces and our voices. I mean, I was online because I did it remotely, but it was an ocular melanoma program focus, so it was great to be able to say, here's what it's like living with a very rare cancer with, at that point, no treatment options for metastatic cancer. And initially it was letting them know, so much of us is about uncertainty, this whole disease for us. Initially, there's no treatment guidelines. Everyone that gets treated, even if you don't have metastatic disease, there's no treatment guidelines. So there's a lot of uncertainties. And then there's no standard of care for metastatic cancer. We have limited access to life-saving clinical trials and treatments. And it's amazing, both speakers already spoke about this. And this was obviously a topic from us as patients to the listening session, which I wanted to talk about. And then we have to deal with the insurance, the denials, because there's no standard of care. Is it really medically necessary? I don't know, there's 2,000 cases a year. So we're always stuck in this level of uncertainty. Dr. Carvajal mentioned, telemedicine. I think that was great at the time for us, but now it's no longer available. So, dealing with specialists, access to care is a huge issue for this rare cancer population. And then the financial toxicity that you have. If you decide you want to live, as we were talking about, you have to go travel to an academic center for your research trials. That's cost, that's lodging, that's food, that's parking, that's tolls. I mean, gas is now over $4 a gallon. So it's all of a sudden you're like, well, I want to live, but wow, that's a really expensive proposition if I don't live in where an academic center is that happens to be having a trial. So that's why I wanted to go. And it was interesting because when you were there, everyone was kind of saying the same things in different parts of the country between caregivers, patients with mets and without mets. It was comforting in a way of how common our themes of concerns were for our cancer. And then I do want to add, when we were there, the best part was, and the previous speaker alluded to it, was the people at the FDA who can make a difference. So there was the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Device and Radiologic Health, and the Office of the Commissioner. They all play a role in the caregiver agenda. When I looked at their titles, I'm like, wow, these people actually can affect, we're talking to the right people. These are the real people. So, I think for them to kind of hear it from us, and then hearing, Laurel talk about that importance of patient advocacy, I was like, wow, this is kind of pretty cool that you guys set this up for us.
And it's been wonderful to see the momentum too, with obviously the first ever FDA approved drug for uveal melanoma, which is really exciting, which I think you can say that you played a huge part in, getting in front of the FDA and advocating for uveal melanoma patients. Not many people can say they did that. So I think you should be really proud of yourself. That's really incredible. So what would you say to fellow patients that might be too nervous to share their story? What would your advice be to them in terms of self-advocating?
Well, I think advocacy takes many roles. If that FDA listening session was the first thing I ever did like that. I don't know how I got involved, but I was like, yes, I want to do it. If I can do it from that day I'm getting treatment. But I think advocacy is from being on different Melanoma Research Foundation has the Zoom meetings for patient connections, going to these conferences. It could be on the Facebook support groups. First of all, I think you have to be comfortable telling your story. So I think once you start getting to the point where you're comfortable with telling your story, it's easier, I think, to march into like, things that you folks might say, hey, does someone want to be on this patient? I participated in one of the research papers that we had to review a while ago. But you guys set us up for it. Like, you told us how we had to do it. You gave us training. And I think it's the same way for this type of programming is, if someone has an interest, this is not what I normally do. And I spoke with Amy for last week for a bit, what are you looking for? What are the questions? And, that gave me more confidence to say, okay, I do want to participate in this because, I'll be set up to tell my story and do it successfully and, in a moving way. So I think, the MRF allows us to have many forms of advocacy, from maybe more patient and peer to, this to me is very high level advocacy, reaching out to congressional people and saying, hey, this is what your actual patients look like with this disease.
Absolutely. So Kristen, let's talk about clinical trials for a minute, because I think you can offer a really important perspective. And we touched on them with Dr. Carvajal, with Laurel, and you obviously participated in one for almost 2 years. So what is your advice to patients if they're considering a clinical trial, or they're like, oh, I don't know very much about clinical trials? What would you say to them, given your experience?
Well, the physicians might not like this on the line, but the Facebook support groups are fantastic. I mean, especially for a rare disease like ocular melanoma, it's a very tight-knit group. People are always talking about clinical trials because that's what pretty much people always do. So it's like, where's this trial? You can look it up on the NCT clinical trial information, and then say, is it close to me? Can I do this? Luckily I'm in Philadelphia. Dr. Sato is my physician. I feel very comfortable, with, the suggestions. Now, the Penn trial, I found on my own. I'm also BRCA positive. It was a BRCA trial. Did not know if BRCA was to be the driver of my cancer, but 22 months, maybe. But, that was something that I sought out because I was dealing with another physician at Penn. So who knew if it was going to work? Everyone gives you 2 months worth of, everyone scans you every 2 months. So, if it doesn't work, you can go someplace else. So part of that was in my gut. I was like, let's try this. It was a systemic trial I qualified for. Did not qualify for TEBI anymore because I had an ablation. So they were on the phase 3. So I was like, okay, IEs at Jefferson or try a phase 2 clinical trial. So it's not easy. It's not easy with the scans. And I live in Philly, but I will tell you, I visit, probably now that COVID's loosening, a patient a week at Jefferson that flies in for treatment. Flies in. That's 3 days of staying around Philadelphia, food, everything. And they come from all over. So I realize how lucky I am to be in Philadelphia. And I think that's the issue. And Dr. Carvajal mentioned, if anything, with these people, these smart technological people that were at the listening committee, is access to clinical trials. If it could be a smaller one someplace, I think of myself, I live in Philly, but if there's not a trial here or in New York, I'm going to go down to Nashville. And I live next to, I can take a train to New York, but if there's nothing there for me, I'm going to have to be like everyone else that flies to another city to get treatment. And it's heartbreaking on the sites when people like, I want to live, but how can I travel? I mean, I have kids at home I have to care for. I have a spouse at home. Like, it's just, it's driving 4 hours, 6 hours once a week. This woman's flying up from Georgia once a week to Philadelphia for a clinical trial, once a week treatment.
Yeah, no, there's got to be a better way, right? And I think that's
yes. If anything from COVID taught us,
a better way.
Someone has to do that. And also, if we can bring back some sort of telemedicine for rare cancers. I mean, I know doctors aren't regulated in the States, but I think that's more of if that is something that I would personally advocate for. Like, I'd be on your little committee for that if you had that, because that is something that the patients need. That is a huge hurdle now of flying in just to get a read on your scan from a second opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, what Dr. Carvajal said earlier, just about blood work, if you can go to a LabCorp request instead of flying cross country to get some blood work. For your
clinical trials. I mean, luckily I could walk 20 minutes dependent. But yeah, I had it so easy. But you feel for other people that don't. Yeah. And you wonder what you would do. Like, do I really want to go down to Nashville once a week for treatment? How's that going to affect my whole entire family? Yeah. And people are making that decision every day.
Yeah, decisions you should never have to make, right?
Right. Now I'm talking about the insurance denials, or they're trying to get the referrals. I mean, you have this horrible disease that's a rare cancer. no treatment options. Now, if you're HLA positive, you get one treatment option. Okay, that's all you got. And then you have to deal with the insurance and then the hopes of maybe of a clinical trial. And then is it still open or not, like depending on the phasing, you know? So there's just so many, I guess the best thing is just uncertainties, and you just have to like pick something and ride it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for using your voice. Thank you for advocating for ocular melanoma patients, being a part of our FDA listing session, sharing your story again here today. You're going to help so many people, Kristen. We're just so grateful. And like you said, there's a lot of opportunities to get involved with the MRF and our advocacy program and use your story and use your voice for change for all melanoma patients, especially patients with rare subtypes. So thank you very much. I want to open up just a couple of questions to the whole panel here. So if you all give me 1 second, I'm going to open up our little Q&A box. We have a couple questions that came in. So Kristen's comment about telemedicine. So I wanted to, there was a question about that. I think it was a good one because I didn't even know this. So what are the policies in place that prevent telemedicine services to be inaccessible or accessible? You know, is that a center by center? Is that, you know, seemed when COVID happened, it was like telemedicine was it. Whereas before you physically would have to go to your doctor. And I've heard mixed things about some centers saying they'll still do it, some saying they won't. You know, is there a standard on that, on the telemedicine piece? Maybe Dr. Carvajal, you can answer that question for us.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the primary driver is reimbursement, right? So, you know, with COVID, we were allowed to actually bill across state lines for telemedicine. So I could see anyone in any state and bill for that telemed visit. Now, you know, with improvement in the pandemic situation and so forth, that's no longer possible. And so for me to do a telemedicine visit for someone in New York State, that's fine. And I still do that all the time. To be able to do that for my patients in New Jersey, I actually had to get a New Jersey license. I also have a Florida license for my Florida patients. But for me to be able to do that across the country, I would need a state license in every state. And it's 100% for billing. Otherwise, you know, I think many of us are more than happy to do it. In fact, I'd love to do more of it.
So it goes down to billing and insurance at the end of the day. And no doctor is going to get credited in every state across the country so that they can do telemedicine.
So I can tell you, getting a Jersey license, I had to get fingerprinted. I had to find like diplomas from, you know, middle school. It was not easy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and you probably see most of your patients probably live in New Jersey, I would assume, coming into New York for treatment. Mm-hmm. Wow. So again, so kind of going back to Kristen's point, you know, if you have a rare disease and there's only a couple centers of excellence that are doing these larger trials, you do have to physically go there. You know, there is no telemedicine option. Wow. So yeah, I mean, that's a huge barrier. I mean, Laurel, I don't know if you know too much about this, but is there any, you know, is this an opportunity for patients as well to kind of advocate in terms of using their voice? Is there some legislation that we might be able to chime on to in terms of opening this access back up to patients?
Yeah, I'm sure that there is. I haven't followed it too closely of late, but the pandemic absolutely accelerated the use of telemedicine. One, just the comfort level of not getting skeeved out by being on a Zoom call or whatever it is. I think that's the first thing that was kind of the Band-Aid that had to get ripped off. And then there was the part of, oh yeah, now we've got to allow for providers to bill for it. And what does that look like and how do you do it? And I do think that there have been a couple of different telemedicine bills that have kind of wandered their way through Congress, and I don't know where they stand, but those are always perfect opportunities to use your voice and to just write into the office and say, I saw you have this bill, this would be great. You should make these tweaks to make it even better. But please move it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just added to our advocacy agenda here at the MRF.
You're welcome.
I'll be on that one.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you today for joining us. I think this was such a great topic and so informative for our community and just appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to join our advocacy days and speak with us today.